Anthropology is about race. And I don't mean to provoke by saying this, it's just a fact. It's been interested in genetic populations forever. Now, the word has been overused and can create some confusion. So there's a couple of things that can be said quickly that, can unravel a lot of the confusion around the word. So first and foremost, there's a very official distinction that you can see in dictionaries that is about racialism and racism. Racialism is really just the idea that you recognize that there are races. Racism is the idea that certain races are superior to others. Now, when we say race, what we historically mean is genetic population. For example, I think he was called Mackenzie somewhere in 1952, maybe when the Dominion of Canada became Canada, the country. He said that historically it was a country that is the unification of two, beautiful races, and you see them on the like the symbol of Canada. I don't remember how you say this in English, but like the lion and the licorne, the unicorn. And so one being the French, the unicorn, and one being the English, the lion. And so when they said races, this is, in a very positive sense, in the sense that Canada brings together two beautiful races. They weren't saying the whites and the red First Nation. They were saying French and English, because that's how, less than a century ago, people spoke about race. So, for example, even Hitler was never talking about black and white. So there was a time around 17th century where certain theories were about five colors: black, brown, yellow, red, white. But most of the time, when we speak about genetic population, we mean something that is very scientific. Now, with modern polarized society, we've seen the comebacks of notions like the blacks and the whites, especially in the USA for historical reason about slavery and all that. But sometimes in Canada we see it, but more maybe in a difference between, as I said, the whites and the reds, the First Nation. But again, this is another level of confusion. So I did put aside racism and racialism in the sense that because you recognize race does not mean that you think one race is above another. But what do you mean by race? If you mean it as a genetic population, you do your DNA test, and I'm able to say that you have some DNA that only exists in this genetic population. Well, that's just scientific truth. That's just obvious. But if you mean it in a sense that all blacks are the same, or even if you're not saying that one race is superior to another, but that, there is such a thing as the whites, as if it's a DNA test that will say you are white, which does not exist. This is maybe another type of racism. But again, to avoid the confusion, that's not what racism means. So if you call somebody a racist, what you really should be looking at is that did they, in the way that they spoke or, theorized something, put the idea that one race is inferior. So you can see it. For example, right now there's lots of tension in Middle East between let's say Gaza and Israel. So if, for example, you hear people say that the Jews are bad, even if you're not saying whites, you're just saying a very small genetic population that can be called the Jews, even if there was modern conversion, whatever. Generally speaking, you say, okay, there is a branch of genetic population that we can call the Jews. If you're saying that they are in and of itself inferior, and that they, what's the word? Not they should, but that they merit I'm searching for a word. Merit in French. Mérite. They deserve. That's the word I was searching for. They deserve to be exterminated, take country destroyed. Genocide. Well, that's, we can say, a way to say that they are inferior. If in and of itself you think a certain people For example, I once heard an Anglophone in Canada say that there was more corruption in Quebec, which proves that the Quebec people are inferior. Well, that's racism because you're saying that there is a specific group that is, yes, a culture, but you can trace a common DNA statistically speaking. So you do have a genetic population that is somewhat inferior because of a certain level of corruption that could be attributed to other things like the fact that they are not sovereign in their own land, that they are a system within a system. There's many reasons why corruption could exist. But if you're saying that it's because a certain genetic population is inferior, that's racism. That's where you can say, okay, it's racism. So, not necessarily saying white or black in and of itself is a racist statement, but when you're really, in a way, connoting it to saying that it implies that they are, as a genetic group, inferior, that would be the definition of racism. Talking generally about the fact that there are differences between genetic population, but that they don't mean superiority. They just mean differences. And you can, it's subtle sometimes. For example, most of the people that have been the fastest people at 100-meter in the Olympics were either Jamaicans or from Jamaican descent. So you could say that the Jamaicans are superior. Well, but what you could really be saying, which would be less racist and more racialist, would be that they seem to have a protein or a culture that makes it so that they do tend to value uh, racing in a way that makes them better. So superior, but in this very small, precise way. For example, people with black skin are superior in their tolerance to the sun. They will get less problem with cancer skin or all that. They can have cancer skin, but there will be less problems. So, in a nutshell, racism really is the notion that one group is superior to another and not that they have differences that can make them superior on very specific things, but as a whole are not superior to another. Or you can also say that maybe some type of problematic is in regards to the fact that people are not talking about genetic population, but very superficial traits like skin color, which is not a race. So maybe that's just not so much racism, but scientific inaccuracy. Because anthropology as a science is indeed about race, but we need to understand what words mean when we say such dangerous words. Anthropology is about race.